3 a.m., my son called me. Help! I was robbed and abandoned 200 miles from home. When I got there, I found him freezing in the storm. He had been left behind by my daughter-in-law and her lover. The next day, I put my plan into action. Both of them fainted at what I did. I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from, so I can see how far my story has reached. The phone rang at exactly 3:14 in the morning. I know because I stared at the red numbers on my bedside clock for a full 10 seconds before my hand fumbled for the receiver. In 57 years of life, I'd learned that calls at this hour never brought good news. Mom? Wesley's voice cracked through the static, barely recognizable. My son, my 32-year-old boy who hadn't called me Mom in years, sounded like he was drowning. I sat up instantly, every maternal instinct firing at once. Wesley, what's wrong? I need help. The words came out in a broken whisper. I'm stranded. Maisie. She left me here. 200 miles from home, and there's this storm, and I don't have anywhere to go. My heart clenched. Wesley had been married to Maisie for 3 years, and in that time, our relationship had grown distant. She had a way of making plans that never included me, of steering conversations away whenever I tried to connect with my son. I'd told myself it was normal. Newlyweds needed space. But hearing him now, so broken and desperate, I realized how wrong I'd been. Where are you exactly? I was already throwing on clothes, grabbing my car keys. Some motel outside Bakersfield. The Sunset Inn on Highway 99. Mom, I'm so sorry to call you like this, but I didn't know who else. Don't you dare apologize. I cut him off, my voice fierce with protective love. I hadn't felt this strongly in years. I'm coming to get you right now. The drive through the night felt eternal. Rain pelted my windshield so hard the wipers could barely keep up. Every few miles I'd hit a patch where the wind nearly pushed my car off the road. All I could think about was Wesley, alone and abandoned in this weather. What kind of woman leaves her husband stranded 200 miles from home? What kind of emergency could have been so urgent that she couldn't wait for him to come with her, then so unimportant that she could just abandon him? The questions churned in my mind as I gripped the steering wheel, my knuckles white against the black leather. I'd never liked Maisie much, if I'm being honest. There was something about her smile that never quite reached her eyes, something calculating in the way she watched people. But Wesley loved her, or thought he did, and I'd kept my concerns to myself. Maybe that had been my first mistake. When I finally pulled into the parking lot of the Sunset Inn, my heart nearly broke. There was Wesley, sitting on a bench outside the motel office, soaked to the bone, despite the thin overhang. His shoulders were hunched against the cold, and he looked smaller somehow, diminished in a way that had nothing to do with the storm. I ran to him, not caring about the rain. Wesley, honey, oh my God. He looked up at me, and I saw something in his eyes I hadn't seen since he was a little boy having a nightmare. Pure, vulnerable fear. She's not coming back, is she? I wrapped my arms around him, feeling how he shivered against me. His clothes were soaked through and his skin felt ice cold. Let's get you warm first. Then you can tell me everything. We went inside the motel office where a tired-looking clerk gave us suspicious looks. I didn't care. I was focused on Wesley, on the way his hands shook as he tried to sign the register for a room. I don't have much cash on me, he mumbled, embarrassment coloring his voice. Maisie took my wallet when they left. They. The word hit me like a physical blow. So there had been someone else with her. I've got it, I said, handing over my credit card. The room was $49 for the night, a small price for getting my son somewhere warm and safe. Once we were in the room, I cranked up the heat and made Wesley get out of his wet clothes. I gave him my jacket to wear while his shirt dried over the heating unit. Only then did I really look at him, really see what this night had cost him. There were dark circles under his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights that had nothing to do with tonight's events. He'd lost weight since I'd seen him last Christmas, his face gaunt in a way that suggested more than just missing a few meals. But it was the look in his eyes that scared me most, the hollow expression of someone who'd had their trust shattered completely. Tell me what happened, I said gently, sitting beside him on the narrow motel bed. Wesley stared at the floor for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. She said her sister was in an accident. Said we needed to drive up to Bakersfield immediately to see her in the hospital. But when we got here, he swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing with the effort. When we got here, there was no hospital visit. Instead, she had me wait in the car while she went into this house, said she'd be right back. That was 6 hours ago. I felt anger building in my chest, hot and protective. 6 hours? In this storm. I finally went to the door. That's when I saw them. His voice cracked completely. Maisie and some guy I'd never seen before. They were kissing. And when she saw me, she didn't even look sorry. She just said she was done pretending, that she'd found someone who could give her what she really wanted. The room fell silent except for the sound of rain against the window and the hum of the heating unit. I reached out and took Wesley's hand in both of mine. It was still so cold. Did she say anything else? Wesley nodded, tears finally starting to fall. She said I was weak, that I let my mother control me too much, and that real men don't need their mothers to fight their battles. He looked at me with devastation in his eyes. She said she was keeping the house, the car, everything. Said if I tried to fight her, she'd make sure I lost even more. Something shifted inside me then, something I hadn't felt since Wesley was small and another kid had pushed him off his bike. It was a fierce, protective rage that made my hands steady and my mind crystal clear. My son had been played, manipulated, and abandoned by a woman who had systematically isolated him from his family and friends, a woman who had taken advantage of his gentle nature and turned it against him. But Maisie had made one crucial mistake. She'd messed with my child. And now she was going to learn exactly what this mother was capable of when someone hurt her son. Wesley fell asleep around dawn, exhausted from the emotional trauma and the cold. I sat in the uncomfortable motel chair watching him breathe and began planning. For the first time in 3 years, I had my son back, broken and hurt, but back. Maisie thought she'd won. She thought Wesley would just disappear quietly, that he'd be too embarrassed and defeated to fight back. She didn't know his mother very well. The drive back home took 4 hours. Wesley slept for most of it, curled up in the passenger seat like he used to do when he was young, and we'd take long road trips. But this wasn't a vacation, and my 32-year-old son shouldn't have been broken enough to sleep like an exhausted child. Every few minutes I'd glance over at him and feel that protective rage building stronger. His face was peaceful in sleep, but I could see the stress lines that hadn't been there before his marriage. When had he gotten so thin? When had those shadows appeared under his eyes? When had I stopped really looking at my son? As we got closer to home, Wesley began to stir. He opened his eyes and stared out the window for a moment, like he was trying to remember where he was and why. "How are you feeling?" I asked softly. He rubbed his face with both hands. "Like I've been hit by a truck." He paused, then added with bitter laughter, "Or like I've just realized my entire marriage was a lie. Do you want to talk about it?" Wesley was quiet for so long I thought he might have decided not to answer. Then he started talking, and once he began, it all came pouring out like water through a broken dam. "It started about 6 months ago," he said, still staring out the window. "Maisie began having these girls' nights that would last until 3 or 4 in the morning. When I asked about them, she'd get defensive, say I was being controlling like my mother. I bit back the response that rose to my lips. Now wasn't the time to defend myself. She started picking fights about everything. The way I loaded the dishwasher, the way I folded laundry, the fact that I called you on Sundays. She said I was too dependent on you, that I needed to choose between being a mama's boy or being a real husband. The manipulation was so clear from the outside, but I knew how insidious it must have been to live through. What did you do? I tried to make her happy. I stopped calling you as much, stopped going to Sunday dinners. I thought if I proved I could put her first, things would get better between us. My heart ached for him, for both of us. But they didn't. They got worse. She'd disappear for whole days at a time, claiming she was helping friends with emergencies or working overtime at jobs she never seemed to actually go to. When I asked questions, she'd turn it back on me, say I was paranoid, jealous, suffocating her. Wesley shifted in his seat, finally looking at me. "Mom," I started to believe her. I started to think maybe I was the problem. Maybe I was too clingy, too needy. Maybe I wasn't man enough for her. The raw pain in his voice nearly broke me. This was what Maisie had done to my confident, kind-hearted son. She'd systematically torn down his self-worth until he doubted his own perceptions. Last month, money started disappearing from our joint account. When I confronted her about it, she said she'd been buying things for the house, but I never saw any new purchases. She got angry that I was checking up on her and said real husbands trust their wives. "How much money?" I asked. Wesley's jaw clenched. "Over the past 3 months? About $8,000. $8,000. My son worked construction. Hard physical labor that left him exhausted at the end of each day. $8,000 represented months of his sweat and effort. "There's more," Wesley continued, his voice getting smaller. "2 weeks ago, I came home early from a job site because I wasn't feeling well. I found her on the phone in our bedroom talking in this voice I'd never heard before, soft and flirty and intimate." He took a shaky breath. "When she saw me, she hung up immediately and said it was her sister. But when I asked how her sister was doing later, she had no idea what I was talking about." We were pulling into my driveway now, but I didn't get out immediately. I could tell Wesley needed to finish this. "The night before last night," he continued, "she came home at 2 in the morning with a story about helping a co-worker move, but her clothes smelled like men's cologne, and she had grass stains on her knees." His voice broke slightly. "When I asked about it, she flew into a rage like I'd never seen before, called me pathetic and paranoid, and said if I didn't trust her, maybe we shouldn't be married." The picture was becoming clear, and it was uglier than I'd imagined. This hadn't been a sudden betrayal. It had been a calculated campaign to destroy my son's confidence while she robbed him blind and cheated on him. Then yesterday morning, she got that call about her sister being in an accident. She was crying, seemed genuinely upset. I felt terrible for doubting her. Wesley laughed bitterly. "I insisted on driving her up there myself. Told her she was too upset to drive safely. But there was no accident. There was no accident. Her sister lives in Portland, not Bakersfield. I should have known that, but Maisie had me so turned around I was doubting my own memory about everything." We sat in silence for a moment. Then Wesley asked the question I'd been dreading. "Mom, how did I let this happen to me? How did I become so stupid?" I turned to face him fully, taking his hands in mine. "You're not stupid, Wesley. You're trusting and kind, and you loved someone who didn't deserve it. That's not a character flaw. That's what makes you a good man. A good man who just lost his house, his car, and his savings account to a woman who was probably laughing at him the whole time." The defeat in his voice made my decision for me. Wesley needed more than comfort right now. He needed justice. And if he couldn't fight for himself yet, then his mother would fight for him. "Tell me about the house," I said. "Is it in both your names?" Wesley shook his head. "That's another thing. When we bought it, Maisie convinced me to put it in her name only. Said it would be better for tax purposes since she had better credit. I trusted her." He laughed bitterly again. "I trusted her with everything. What about the car? Also in her name. She said it was easier for insurance." I was starting to see the scope of Maisie's planning. This hadn't been a crime of passion. It had been a methodical theft disguised as a marriage. "Wesley, I need you to think carefully. Do you have any proof of the money you contributed to the house? Bank statements, receipts, anything?" He nodded slowly. "I kept records of all my deposits, all the home improvement money I spent. Why? Because your wife may think she's won, but she doesn't know what she's dealing with yet." As we finally got out of the car and headed into my house, I was already formulating a plan. Maisie had spent 3 years isolating my son from his family, systematically destroying his confidence and stealing his money. She'd abandoned him in a storm 200 miles from home without a second thought. She thought Wesley would slink away quietly, too embarrassed and broken to fight back. But Maisie had forgotten something important. Wesley wasn't alone anymore. He had his mother back, and this mother was done playing nice. For the first week, I focused entirely on Wesley. My son was more broken than I'd initially realized, and watching him try to rebuild even the basic routines of daily life broke my heart repeatedly. He'd sit at my kitchen table for an hour in the mornings, just staring at his coffee cup like he was trying to solve some impossible puzzle. When the phone rang, he'd flinch. When I asked what he wanted for dinner, he'd look genuinely confused, as if the concept of having preferences had been stripped away from him. "I don't know," he'd say to the simplest questions. "I don't know what I like anymore." That's what Maisie had done to him. She'd spent 3 years teaching him that his opinions didn't matter, that his wants were inconvenient, that his very existence was somehow too much. She'd turned my confident, decisive son into someone who was afraid to have preferences about his own life. But I also saw glimpses of the man he used to be. When he helped me fix the squeaky hinge on my garden gate, his hands moved with the same sure competence they'd always had. When my neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, mentioned her grandson was struggling with bullies at school, Wesley spent 20 minutes giving thoughtful, caring advice. The core of who Wesley was hadn't been destroyed. It had just been buried under 3 years of systematic emotional abuse.
On day 8, while Wesley was taking his afternoon nap, another sign of how emotionally exhausted he was, I decided it was time to start gathering information. I sat down at my computer and began researching everything I could about Maisie Collins, the woman who had married my son. What I found was illuminating and infuriating.
Maisie had been married before Wesley. Twice, actually. Her first marriage had lasted 18 months and ended in a messy divorce where she'd accused her husband of being controlling and abusive. Her second marriage lasted 2 years and ended the same way, with allegations of emotional abuse and her taking half of everything in the settlement. I found the court records online. In both cases, Maisie had claimed financial hardship and emotional trauma. In both cases, she'd walked away with significant settlements and property. And in both cases, her ex-husbands had been described by friends and family as gentle, kind men who seemed broken by the experience. Wesley was just the latest in a pattern. I printed everything out and created a file. Then I started digging deeper. Maisie's social media told an interesting story. Her Facebook page was full of photos from the past 6 months showing her at expensive restaurants, wearing new jewelry, taking weekend trips to places like Napa Valley and San Diego, all while claiming to Wesley that money was tight and they needed to be careful about spending. But the most revealing thing was a photo from 3 weeks ago. Maisie at some upscale bar, her arm around a man I didn't recognize. The caption read, "Finally found someone who appreciates the real me," with a heart emoji. 3 weeks ago, while she was still married to my son, still living in the house he'd helped pay for, still taking money from their joint account. I cross-referenced the man in the photo with her other social media posts. His name was Derek Chen, and according to his LinkedIn profile, he was a regional sales manager for a tech company. He drove a BMW, lived in a condo in the expensive part of town, and based on his posts, had no idea that his new girlfriend was still married. This was getting interesting. I spent the next few days conducting what I started thinking of as surveillance, though I was careful never to call it that out loud. I drove by the house Wesley and Maisie had shared, the house that was legally in her name, but had been paid for largely with his money. Sure enough, there was a dark blue BMW parked in the driveway, Derek's car. I watched from down the street as they came and went. Maisie had clearly moved Derek in already. Less than 2 weeks after abandoning Wesley in that storm, they looked comfortable together, familiar in a way that suggested this relationship had been going on for much longer than 3 weeks. On the third day of my watching, I saw something that made my blood boil. They were loading Wesley's belongings into garbage bags and setting them out on the curb. His tools, his clothes, his books, everything that represented his life being treated like trash. I waited until they went back inside, then drove over and loaded everything into my car. It took 3 trips, but I saved what I could of my son's possessions. The symbolism wasn't lost on me. Maisie was literally throwing Wesley away, and I was picking up the pieces. That night, Wesley came into the kitchen while I was sorting through his rescued belongings. "Where did you get all this?" he asked, his voice thick with emotion as he picked up a photo of us from his high school graduation. "It was on the curb at your house. I thought you might want it back." He sat down heavily at the table, cradling the photo like it was something precious. She threw away everything, even the watch my grandfather left me. I reached into one of the bags and pulled out the watch, a simple silver Timex that had been worn smooth by 3 generations of hands. Not everything. Wesley's eyes filled with tears as I placed it in his palm. I thought it was gone forever. "Some things are worth fighting for," I said quietly. "Some people are worth fighting for." He looked at me then, really looked at me, and I saw something shift in his expression. A spark of the man he used to be. "What are you planning, Mom?" I could have lied to him, told him I wasn't planning anything, but Wesley deserved the truth, and more importantly, he deserved the chance to be part of his own recovery. "I'm planning to make sure Maisie doesn't get to do this to anyone else, and I'm planning to get back what she stole from you. She's not going to just give it back because we ask nicely." "No," I agreed. "She's not." Wesley was quiet for a long moment, turning his grandfather's watch over in his hands. "What do you need me to do?" The question filled me with fierce pride. My son was ready to fight back. "I need you to help me gather evidence, bank records, receipts, anything that shows what you contributed to the house and what she took from the joint account. I have most of that stuff in a box in my truck." "Good. We're also going to need to document her current situation, the fact that she's living with another man, spending money that should be community property, disposing of your personal belongings." Wesley nodded, and for the first time since I'd found him at that motel, he looked focused and determined. There's something else, I continued. I did some research on Maisie's background. You're not her first husband, Wesley. She's done this before twice, and both times she walked away with everything while her ex-husbands were left with nothing. I watched his face as this information sank in. Instead of making him feel worse, it seemed to strengthen his resolve. So this was never about love, he said quietly. This was always a business arrangement for her. I believe so, yes. Wesley was quiet for several minutes, just sitting there holding his grandfather's watch. Finally, he looked up at me with eyes that were clearer than they'd been since the night I'd rescued him. When do we start? I smiled at my son, feeling something fierce and protective and absolutely determined settle into my bones. We already have. That night, I lay in bed making lists and plans. Maisie thought she was safe, thought she'd covered all her bases and that Wesley would just disappear quietly into the background of her life. She was about to learn how wrong she was. Because while she'd been busy manipulating my son, I'd been spending 57 years learning how the world really worked. I'd been a single mother, a working woman, someone who'd had to fight for everything I'd ever achieved. Maisie had picked the wrong family to mess with. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. I was at the grocery store, minding my own business in the produce section, when I heard a familiar voice behind me. I'm telling you, Linda, she took him for everything he had. Poor David never saw it coming. I turned around to see Nancy Morrison, a woman I'd known peripherally from church functions over the years. She was talking to another woman about someone's divorce, but something about the way she described the situation made my ears perk up. Excuse me, Nancy, I said, approaching them casually. I couldn't help but overhear. You were talking about someone's divorce? Nancy looked a little embarrassed at being overheard gossiping, but she nodded. My neighbor David. He went through a terrible divorce about 4 years ago. His wife cleaned him out completely, then claimed he was abusive when he tried to fight for his fair share. My heart started beating faster. What was his wife's name? Maisie something. Maisie Collins, I think. Pretty girl, but cold as ice underneath all that charm. Bingo. Is David still your neighbor? I ask because my son is going through something similar, and it might help him to talk to someone who's been through it. Nancy's expression softened with sympathy. Oh, honey, I'm so sorry. Yes, David still lives next door. He'd probably be happy to talk. He's still pretty bitter about the whole thing, and I can't blame him. That afternoon, I found myself sitting in David Martinez's modest living room, listening to a story that was eerily familiar. David was a soft-spoken man in his 40s who worked as an accountant. He'd met Maisie at a coffee shop, been charmed by her attention and apparent vulnerability. She had this way of making you feel like you were the most important person in the world, he told me, his voice still carrying pain 4 years later, at least at first. The pattern was exactly what Wesley had experienced. The gradual isolation from friends and family, the picking fights about everything, the mysterious disappearances and financial discrepancies. I started keeping records after the first year, David said, pulling out a thick folder. Something felt off, but she made me feel like I was paranoid for questioning her. Turns out my instincts were right. He showed me bank statements, receipts, phone records, evidence of a systematic campaign to drain his accounts while building a case that he was controlling and abusive. She had this friend, another woman who went through the same thing with her first husband. They'd coach each other on what to say in court, how to make their husbands look bad. Another victim? David shook his head grimly. Another predator. They worked together, sharing strategies. I found out later that Maisie had done this twice before me, and her friend had done it 3 times. This was bigger than I'd thought. This wasn't just one woman making bad choices. This was a pattern of deliberate, calculated fraud. David, would you be willing to testify about your experience if it came to that? My son is in the same situation you were in. He didn't hesitate. Absolutely. That woman destroyed my life for 3 years. If I can help prevent her from doing it to someone else, I'm in. I left David's house with copies of his documentation and a fire burning in my chest. Maisie wasn't just a cheating wife. She was a serial predator who targeted kind, gentle men and systematically destroyed them. That evening, I called Wesley into the kitchen and spread David's papers out on the table next to the evidence we'd been gathering about his own situation. Look at this, I said, pointing to the patterns. The timeline, the methods, even some of the specific accusations she made, it's all identical to what she did to you. Wesley studied the documents with growing amazement. It's like she was following a script. She was. This is what she does, Wesley. You weren't unlucky in love. You were targeted by someone who makes a living destroying good men. Over the next week, I used the information David had given me to track down Maisie's first husband, Michael Rodriguez. He was harder to find. He'd moved across the country after his divorce. But when I finally reached him by phone, his story was the same. She came into my life like a whirlwind, Michael told me. Beautiful, charming, seemed to really need someone to take care of her. Within 6 months, she'd moved in. Within a year, we were married. Within 18 months, she'd taken half of everything I owned and disappeared with some guy she claimed was just a friend. 3 victims, all telling the same story, all decent men who'd been targeted, manipulated, and discarded when Maisie had extracted everything she could from them. But I wasn't done investigating. I hired a private investigator, something I never thought I'd do in my life, but desperate times called for desperate measures. His name was Frank Petrosky, a retired police detective who specialized in domestic cases. What you're describing sounds like a pattern of marriage fraud, Frank told me during our first meeting. It's more common than people think, but it's hard to prosecute because the emotional manipulation makes the victims look complicit. What can we do about it? We build an airtight case, document everything, the pattern of behavior, the financial fraud, the false statements she's made. If we can establish that this was premeditated and part of a larger scheme, we might have criminal charges to work with, not just civil ones. Frank's investigation over the following 2 weeks uncovered even more damaging information. Maisie had credit cards in Wesley's name that he didn't know about, totaling over $12,000 in debt. She'd taken out a loan against the house that Wesley had helped pay for but wasn't legally entitled to because she'd convinced him to put it in her name only. Most damning of all, Frank found evidence that Maisie had been planning her exit strategy for months. She'd opened bank accounts in her own name, transferred money systematically, and had been communicating with Derek Chen for over 6 months before she finally abandoned Wesley. She didn't meet this guy after your son, Frank explained, showing me phone records and social media evidence. She was with him the whole time. This was a planned operation. The scope of the betrayal was staggering. While Wesley had been trying desperately to save his marriage, working extra hours to pay for the house and the lifestyle Maisie demanded, she'd been systematically stealing from him and planning her escape with another man. But the most important thing Frank discovered was that Derek Chen had no idea Maisie was married. According to Frank's investigation, she'd told Derek that Wesley was an abusive ex-boyfriend who was stalking her. She's playing both sides, Frank told me. Your son thinks he's been abandoned for another man, and the other man thinks he's rescuing her from an abusive relationship. This gave me an idea. A terrible, brilliant, absolutely perfect idea. That night I sat Wesley down and laid out everything we'd learned. All of it. The pattern with her previous marriages, the financial fraud, the fact that her relationship with Derek had been going on for months. Everything. Wesley listened in silence, his face growing harder with each revelation. She never loved me at all, he said finally. It wasn't a question. No, honey, I don't think she did. And Derek doesn't know any of this? Not according to Frank's investigation. She's told him you're a stalker ex-boyfriend. Wesley was quiet for a long time, staring at the pile of evidence that represented 3 years of systematic deception. What's the plan, Mom? I smiled at my son, feeling that fierce protective instinct crystallize into something sharp and focused. We're going to give both of them exactly what they deserve, and we're going to do it in a way that ensures Maisie never gets the chance to do this to anyone else. The look in Wesley's eyes told me he was ready for whatever came next. Maisie had made her biggest mistake when she underestimated what a mother would do to protect her child. The opportunity presented itself on a Saturday afternoon in March. Frank had been monitoring Maisie's social media, and she'd posted about hosting a housewarming party for her and Derek's new life together. The irony wasn't lost on me. She was throwing a party in the house my son had helped pay for, celebrating a relationship built on lies and theft. But her arrogance was about to become her downfall. I spent the week before the party making final preparations. Wesley and I had organized all our evidence into a comprehensive file: bank statements, receipts, testimony from her previous victims, Frank's investigation report, and most importantly, proof that her relationship with Derek had been going on for months while she was still married. "Are you sure you want to do this in front of all those people?" Wesley asked the night before. He was nervous, and I couldn't blame him. This wasn't going to be subtle. "Honey, Maisie has spent years controlling the narrative about her relationships. She gets to be the victim, the wronged party, the one who was forced to leave because her husband was inadequate. This time, people are going to hear the truth." Frank had helped us identify several of the people who would be at the party. Derek's co-workers, some of Maisie's friends, a few neighbors. These were the people who had probably heard Maisie's version of events. That Wesley was an abusive ex who couldn't handle her success and independence. It was time they heard the real story. I arrived at the party at 7:30, carrying a gift bag and wearing my most pleasant smile. The house looked different from when Wesley had lived there. More expensive furniture, new artwork, fresh flowers everywhere. All paid for with money that should have been community property. Maisie answered the door herself, and I watched her face cycle through confusion, recognition, and barely controlled panic in the space of about 3 seconds. "Daryl, what are you? How did you know about the party?" "Social media," I said cheerfully, holding up the gift bag. "I brought a housewarming present. I hope you don't mind me stopping by." Before she could object, I stepped past her into the living room. The space was full of people, maybe 20 or 25 guests, all holding wine glasses and chatting comfortably. Derek was across the room talking to a group of men I assumed were his co-workers. Maisie followed me, her voice tight with forced politeness. "This is really not a good time, Daryl. This is a private party." "Oh, I understand completely. I just wanted to congratulate you both on your new relationship. It's so refreshing to see young love, especially when it's been going on for so long." I said it loud enough for several nearby guests to hear, and I saw a few heads turn in our direction. Maisie's smile became strained. "I'm not sure what you mean." "Derek seems like such a nice man. I'm sure he has no idea what he's gotten himself into." Now I definitely had people's attention. Conversations were slowing down, and I could feel the energy in the room shifting. Derek had noticed the commotion and was making his way over. He was handsome in a conventional way, dressed in an expensive sweater and designer jeans. The kind of man who clearly had money and was used to getting what he wanted. "Daryl, I think you should leave," Maisie said, her voice losing its pretense of warmth. "Actually, I think Derek should hear what I have to say first." I turned to face him as he approached. "Derek, I'm Daryl, Wesley's mother." I watched his face carefully as I said Wesley's name. There was a flicker of recognition, followed by something that looked like wariness. "Wesley," he repeated slowly. "Maisie's husband," I clarified, and the room went completely silent. Derek's face went pale. "Her what?" "Her husband. They've been married for 3 years. Well, technically still married, since no divorce papers have been filed yet." The silence in the room was deafening. Every conversation had stopped, and all eyes were on the three of us. Derek turned to Maisie, his voice barely controlled. "You told me he was your abusive ex-boyfriend. You said you were afraid of him." "He is," Maisie said quickly, but her voice was shaking now. "Daryl, you need to leave. You're causing a scene." "Am I?" I looked around at all the faces staring at us. I think these people deserve to know what kind of party they're actually attending. I reached into my gift bag and pulled out a manila folder. "Derek, these are copies of bank statements from the joint account Maisie shared with Wesley. You'll notice that over $8,000 was withdrawn from their account over the past 6 months, around the same time your relationship with her began." Derek took the folder with trembling hands, his face growing darker as he flipped through the pages. "These are also copies of phone records showing that Maisie has been in contact with you for over 6 months, while she was still living with Wesley and claiming to be trying to save her marriage. By now, the entire party had gathered around us. I could see phones being pulled out, people starting to record. Maisie's carefully constructed image was crumbling in real time. She told me they'd been broken up for over a year. Derek said, his voice hollow. She said he was stalking her, that she was afraid to be alone. "Wesley is one of the gentlest men you'll ever meet," I said firmly. "But he's not the first man Maisie has done this to. She's been married 3 times, and each time she's taken everything she could get and moved on to the next victim." I pulled out more papers from the folder. These are statements from her previous husbands, David Martinez and Michael Rodriguez. Same pattern of behavior, same methods, same outcome. Maisie finally exploded. "You crazy old bitch! You have no right to come into my home and spread these lies." but her outburst only made her look worse. The mask had finally slipped completely, and everyone in the room could see the ugly reality underneath. Derek was still reading through the documents, his face a mixture of hurt and rage. 6 months, he said quietly. You've been lying to me for 6 months. Derek, honey, you don't understand. Maisie started, reaching for his arm. He pulled away from her like she was poisonous. Don't touch me. Don't ever touch me again. The room was buzzing now, people whispering to each other, some taking pictures of the documents Derek was holding. Maisie's social circle was watching her reputation disintegrate before their eyes. There's more, I said, pulling out the final piece of evidence. Frank Petrosky is a private investigator who's been looking into Maisie's activities. He found that she's taken out loans and credit cards in Wesley's name without his knowledge, totaling over $12,000 in debt that she stuck him with. I handed Derek the investigator's report. She's also been disposing of Wesley's personal property, including items with sentimental value that belonged to his deceased grandfather. By this point, Derek was shaking with rage. Is any of this true? He demanded, turning to face Maisie. But Maisie was no longer the composed, charming woman who had answered the door. Her face was twisted with fury and desperation, her carefully styled hair disheveled from running her hands through it. None of you understand, she snarled. These men are weak. They're pathetic. I gave them more excitement and passion than they ever deserved, and when I outgrew them, they couldn't handle it. The cruelty in her voice was shocking. Several people in the room actually stepped back from her. I took what I was owed, she continued, seemingly unaware of how she sounded. I wasted years of my life on these losers. The money, the houses, the cars, that was payment for services rendered. Derek was staring at her like he was seeing her for the first time. Services rendered? You're talking about marriage like it was prostitution. Maybe it was, Maisie shot back. Maybe that's all any of you pathetic men deserve. The room erupted in shocked murmurs. Someone near the back called out, "This is disgusting," and several people started heading for the door. Derek set the folder down on the nearest table and looked at Maisie with complete contempt. We're done. I want you out of my life, and I want you out of this house. Your house? Maisie laughed bitterly. This is my house. I got it in my divorce from Wesley. Actually, I said quietly, that's not entirely accurate either. I pulled out one more document. This is a copy of the mortgage application for this house. Wesley's signature is on it, along with documentation showing that he contributed 60% of the down payment and has been making the majority of the mortgage payments for 3 years. I looked directly at Maisie. Just because you convinced him to put the house in your name only doesn't mean you have legal right to it, especially when the marriage was fraudulent from the beginning. The fight went out of Maisie all at once. She looked around the room at all the faces staring at her with disgust and disbelief, and I saw the moment she realized her life as she knew it was over. Derek was already walking toward the door. I'm calling my lawyer first thing Monday morning, he said without looking back. I want to know what other lies you've told me. As the guests filed out of the house, many of them stopping to express their sympathy to me and their disgust at what they'd witnessed, Maisie stood alone in the middle of her stolen living room. This isn't over, she said to me, but her voice had lost all its power. Yes, it is, I replied calmly. This is exactly how it ends for women like you. I walked out of that house feeling lighter than I had in months. Maisie's web of lies had been exposed, her victims had found each other, and her newest target had escaped before she could destroy him too. But most importantly, my son was going to get justice. The aftermath came swift and decisive. Derek, as it turned out, wasn't just hurt. He was furious at being manipulated, and he had resources to do something about it. By Monday morning, he'd filed a restraining order against Maisie and demanded she vacate the house immediately, since he'd been paying for utilities and improvements under the assumption that she was a single woman escaping an abusive relationship. Wesley and I met with our lawyer Tuesday morning. Armed with all the evidence we'd gathered, the financial records, the testimony from Maisie's previous victims, Frank's investigation report, and documentation of the fraudulent loans and credit cards, we had a case that made our attorney's eyes light up. This is fraud, plain and simple, she told us. Not just civil fraud, but potentially criminal. The systematic nature of it, the pattern across multiple marriages, the forged documents. This goes way beyond a messy divorce. Within 2 weeks, Maisie's carefully constructed world had completely collapsed. Derek had kicked her out of the house and was pursuing his own legal action for fraud and emotional distress. Wesley's lawyer had filed for an emergency hearing to freeze all jointly held assets and recover the money she'd stolen. Most importantly, the district attorney's office was reviewing the case for possible criminal charges. But the real victory wasn't legal, it was personal. I watched my son transform over those weeks from a broken, defeated man back into the strong, confident person I'd raised. It started small. Wesley began sleeping through the night again, stopped flinching when the phone rang, started having opinions about what he wanted for dinner. "You know what I realized?" he told me one morning over coffee. "I spent 3 years walking on eggshells, trying to anticipate what would set her off next. I forgot what it felt like to just be myself. And how does it feel now?" He smiled, a real smile, not the careful, cautious expression he'd worn for so long. "It feels like freedom." 3 months after the confrontation at the party, we got the news we'd been waiting for. Maisie had agreed to a settlement that would return most of Wesley's money and give him his rightful share of the house. More importantly, she'd agreed to plead guilty to fraud charges in exchange for a lighter sentence and restitution to all her victims. "She's going to pay back David and Michael too?" Wesley asked when our lawyer called with the news. "Every penny, plus damages and legal fees." The judge was not impressed with her pattern of behavior, but perhaps the most satisfying call came from Frank the investigator. He'd been contacted by 2 other women whose stories sounded suspiciously similar to Maisie's victims. Apparently, word had spread through various online forums about what had happened, and other people were coming forward. "She's not going to be able to do this to anyone else," Frank told me. "Her name is going to be flagged in every background check database in the country." The house sale went through in April. Wesley got his fair share of the equity, plus the money she'd stolen from their joint accounts, plus damages. It wasn't about the money, though. It was about justice. It was about making sure that someone who had hurt people couldn't keep hurting people. Derek, surprisingly, reached out to Wesley directly to apologize. "I know it's not my fault I was lied to," he told my son during a phone call I overheard. "But I feel terrible that I was part of what happened to you. She used me to hurt you, and I hate that." "You were a victim too," Wesley replied, and I was so proud of the grace in his voice. "She's very good at what she does, was good at what she did," Derek corrected, past tense. By summer, Wesley had bought a small house of his own. Nothing fancy, but it was his, bought with his own money and his own credit. He'd started dating again, cautiously, but hopefully. The woman he was seeing, Jennifer, was a teacher at the local elementary school. She was kind and straightforward and seemed genuinely puzzled when Wesley asked her detailed questions about her past relationships and financial situation. "He's just being careful," I told her when she mentioned it to me. "He's learned to value honesty." "Good," she replied firmly. "Honest is all I know how to be." 1 year after that terrible night when Wesley called me from the motel, we held a celebration dinner at my house. Wesley and Jennifer were there, along with David Martinez and Michael Rodriguez, who had both become genuine friends through this experience. Frank the investigator came too, along with our lawyer and even Derek, who had become an unlikely ally in the whole situation. "I keep thinking about that night in the storm," Wesley said during dinner. "At the time, it felt like the worst thing that had ever happened to me. But if Maisie hadn't abandoned me there, I might never have gotten free of her." "Sometimes the worst moments lead to the best outcomes," David added. "I spent 4 years thinking I was the problem in my marriage. Now I know the truth, and I'm dating someone who actually likes me for who I am." Michael nodded in agreement. "It's weird to say this, but I'm grateful it all came out. I was starting to think I was losing my mind as the evening wound down and our guests started to leave. Wesley helped me clean up the kitchen. We worked in comfortable silence for a while, loading the dishwasher and putting away leftovers. "Mom," he said finally, "I never thanked you properly." "For what?" "For not giving up on me, for fighting for me when I couldn't fight for myself, for showing me that I was worth fighting for." I stopped what I was doing and really looked at my son. He was healthy again, confident again, himself again. But more than that, he was stronger now, wiser. He'd been through something terrible and come out the other side with a better understanding of his own worth. "You never needed me to fight for you," I told him. "You just needed to remember who you were underneath all her lies." "Maybe, but I don't think I could have remembered on my own." We finished cleaning in comfortable silence, and as Wesley was getting ready to leave, he paused at the door. "You know what the best part is?" he said. "What's that?" "I'm not angry anymore. For a while there, I was so furious I could barely see straight, but now I just feel free. She can't hurt me anymore, and she can't hurt anyone else. That's enough. As I watched my son drive away that night, I reflected on everything that had happened. Maisie had tried to destroy Wesley, to break him down and steal everything of value from his life. She'd succeeded for a while, but in the end her own arrogance had been her downfall. The night she abandoned my son in that storm, she thought she was discarding him like trash. What she didn't realize was that she was giving him back to the people who truly loved him. She was giving him back to me. And a mother's love, when it's focused and determined and absolutely furious, is not something to be underestimated. 6 months later, I got a call from a woman named Sarah whose story sounded familiar. Her husband had mentioned my name. Apparently, word was spreading through support groups about what we'd accomplished. "I think my sister-in-law is doing to my brother what Maisie did to your son," she told me. "Would you be willing to talk to me about how you built your case?" I looked at the framed photo on my kitchen table, Wesley and Jennifer at his housewarming party, both of them grinning at the camera with the easy happiness of people who have nothing to hide. "Of course," I told Sarah. "Let me tell you what I learned about fighting for the people you love. Because some battles are worth fighting, and some people are worth saving, and sometimes the person doing the saving is a 57-year-old mother who refuses to let anyone hurt her child. Sometimes that's exactly enough. It's exactly... Now I'm curious about you who listened to my story. What would you do if you were in my place? Have you ever been through something similar? Comment below, and meanwhile, I'm leaving on the final screen 2 other stories that are channel favorites, and they will definitely surprise you. Thank you for watching until here.